and welcome everyone. Good morning to those of you who are on morning time, good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to the World Water Week's Communications Initiative 2022. It's really great to see so many of you here and some familiar faces. I'm really happy about that. My name is Jörel Espeland and I will be your host throughout the workshops. Our technical support and our producer is Cecile Pilon-Hugh. Those of you who were with us last year, remember her, definitely. And just as last year, World Water Week Communications Initiative has been developed in cooperation with the Grundfos Foundation. And this year, we will focus much more on the World Water Week's theme, seeing the unseen, the value of water. During the 2 coming weeks, most of our workshop sessions will center around these 3 headings: the value of water for people and development, financial and economic value of water, and the value of water for nature and climate change. Today is Tuesday, so we have a combined session with journalists and communicators together. On Wednesdays, then we invite the journalists for more specialized sessions, and on Thursdays, it's the communicators' turn. During these Wednesday and Thursday sessions, the presenters will give you tools, tips, and tricks that we hope can be useful for you in your respective professions. So they're a little bit more profession specialized. The full program can be found on this link here that we will show in the chat function. And if you like to join any of the other sessions, you are welcome to do so. Any questions, just send me an email. I'm on the same email as usually, jorel.espeland@siwi.org. And if you have any technical issues during our workshops, please send Cecile an email or a direct chat to her. Her email address is cecile.hue, that's HUE @siwi.org. For all practical reasons, we keep the questions to last after each presentation, and you can write questions in the chat function, and I will then convey them to the presenter. All sessions are recorded. We will send out YouTube links after each workshop, so you can watch afterwards. And if you miss a session, don't worry, the links will arrive in your mailbox. Yeah, I think that's enough for me. And I'm going to introduce you to our very first speaker, Jenny Grönwall, Advisor, Water Policy and Rights at SIWI. And Jenny will shine a light on the world's most forgotten water, groundwater, and why we should care about this invisible resource. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And I believe I am now sharing my screen in presentation mode. Yes, excellent. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so happy there are a lot of people interested in groundwater, which is a topic that is very close to my heart. Today, I will draw on this report that was published earlier this year by the UN Water, the World Water Development Report. And in the very last slide, there will be links to this report. I was one of the lead authors of this report, together with very many other UN and other organizations. And this report provides plenty of information and arguments for why we should care about groundwater as this invisible resource and make it visible. But let's start with what is groundwater? Groundwater is water found underground in aquifers, which in turn can be defined as geological formations of rocks, sands, and gravels that can hold water. But groundwater is also a specific element of the water cycle. But let's leave the technical aspects apart for now, because groundwater can be very technical. And that is also one of the reasons why it is so difficult to communicate, because groundwater is invisible. Aquifers are invisible to our eyes. You cannot search for a stock photo to illustrate groundwater or aquifers, you need to illustrate it in other ways, such as in this infographics that we have here on the slide. And during 2022, I have worked very closely with the communications department at SIWI, and we have developed a campaign on groundwater with several different infographics and shorter texts to ensure that groundwater and aquifers are more comprehensible to everyone. And I do want to emphasize this with aquifers, because to some groundwater hydrogeologists, experts, these sort of matrices underground are as important as the groundwater that sits in them, because those reservoirs can be destroyed, for instance, by land subsidence. So groundwater can be found everywhere on Earth, or in Earth, if you so will, to different degrees, of course. Some details in this map. And groundwater is ubiquitous. It can be found as estimated as constituting 99% of all liquid fresh water on Earth. So when we talk about fresh water, we basically do talk about groundwater, but that is another fact that hasn't really been known or appreciated. So a quarter of all the fresh water that we use comes from groundwater, and it provides half of all the fresh water withdrawn for domestic use and for drinking water. And as we can see in this figure, India is the major groundwater user. But in this graph, you can also see that this withdrawal seems to be leveling off now. Possibly because large parts of India is experience peak groundwater due to the employment of over 20 million tube wells for irrigation only. And those tube wells can be 300 and even 500 meters deep. And these figures in this graph, they relate to human uses and to the multiple values that groundwater has to society. But groundwater and aquifers, they also provide many more services to us and to nature. Some of those services are realized when groundwater is abstracted and put to use as drinking water for irrigation, to ensure base flow to streams and lakes and wetlands. Those are the ex situ ecosystem services. So when the water is extracted or discharged from the aquifer. But there is an increasing importance paid to the regulatory services of groundwater and aquifers. That is how aquifers act as buffers, or you could say as piggy banks during dry seasons and dry periods. And notably, groundwater in situ supports landscapes and the very geology around us or under our feet, particularly in terms of controlling land stability, that is protection against land subsidence. Groundwater is of great importance when we talk about climate change as well. We know that water is the medium through which nature and human societies experience most of the impacts of climate change. Too much, too little. Even when we talk about too dirty groundwater, we can to some extent link that to climate change effects. And groundwater has a role to play in both climate change adaptation and mitigation. And groundwater is very important here. I mentioned the piggy banks and how the aquifers can support dry season availability of water. And groundwater is also less impacted by climatic variations than surface water due to the lower evaporation losses. And it therefore represents great opportunities in terms of adaptation and mitigation. And much research lately has gone into improving our understanding of the interactions between groundwater and climate change. And one impact of climate change, of course, that is also already widely experienced is the intensification of precipitation, that is extreme rains. South Africa, for instance, has experienced too much of this lately. However, there is substantial uncertainty when it comes to the global projections and estimations on climate change on groundwater recharge, which is then linked to these extreme rains. So there's much more that we know today and much more that we can say, but there's also big gaps in our understanding, and that impacts on policy making, of course. As the dependence on groundwater grows globally, there are a number of serious challenges appearing or becoming more acknowledged. One is that extraction that is not matched by recharge can lead to sinking groundwater table and water scarcity, water stress. And some hotspots are marked in this map. Saltwater intrusion is another problem, in particular in coastal cities and in small island developing states. So if the quantitative side of groundwater has been in focus for a long time, and that includes attention paid to where groundwater can be found, where it can be developed, how aquifers are recharged, and then especially then what impact climate change has on this. And also the research on if pumping of from an aquifer is sustainable in the short and the long run. If all of that has been in focus for a long period of time, we now see more attention paid to the qualitative side of groundwater. So the World Water Development Report, it mentions these different challenges. Generally, the quality of groundwater is good. And that is, of course, an advantage with groundwater usage. And the quality is good because groundwater is protected in the reservoirs, aquifers underground. And the advantages with this, of course, include that advanced and costly treatment of this water before consumption can be avoided. And this is, of course, primarily compared with the usage of surface water. So utilities and households with their own wells, they can very often use groundwater as is without prior treatment or with only minor treatment. However, the quality aspects are starting to be taken seriously now. Some challenges with background levels of pollutants, for instance, arsenic in Bangladesh and parts of India and other parts of the world, they have been well recognized and understood for several decades now, but we are constantly learning about this and how to mitigate and deal with arsenic. And 2 years back, the Stockholm Water Prize was awarded to Professor John Sherry for his long-standing work on contaminant hydrogeology. And the World Bank just published several reports on this topic of groundwater and quality aspects as well that I can recommend that you look into. So we see in this slide a number of anthropogenic polluting sources. And they do indeed constitute a great threat to human health and livelihoods and to ecosystems and to biodiversity. And the tricky thing with groundwater here is that, as is the quality of the groundwater, can be very good, but if polluted or if we have natural pollutants in the background, remediation or treatment can be slow, very costly, and very, very difficult. On the other hand, some experts point to that once this groundwater is extracted from the ground and before it is put to use or consumed, this groundwater can always be treated, of course. So having arsenic or having a landfill impacting on the groundwater does not mean that that groundwater cannot be used at all. There are several different purposes to which we can put groundwater, and treatment is available, but costly. One part of the world that has been singled out a little bit more recently, and also so in the World Water Development Report, is the African continent. And more attention is given to the role groundwater can play here because of the great potential and how groundwater has comparatively seen not been very well developed in Africa. So this continent possesses large underground resources, and those are important or can be important for food production, for drinking water supply, of course, and also for economic development. And the conditions vary naturally between different parts of Africa, even between within countries. I have myself worked a lot in Ethiopia, and I know that you have so many different conditions hydrogeologically at different depths and different geographical locations just within that single country. So one should be careful with generalizations, but at large, groundwater has a lot of potential in Africa. And today, only 3% of the total cultivated land in sub-Saharan Africa is under irrigation, and only 5% of that is irrigated with groundwater. So we see that if we utilize groundwater carefully and know more about the aquifer conditions and the recharge conditions, then there is great potential in continuing and even ramping up the groundwater development on this continent. So now that we have this report, we have much more knowledge. 2022 focuses on raising awareness, building capacity around making groundwater much more visible, put it more to use, protect it better. What are the recommendations? So one of them concerns groundwater for realizing human rights. From a governance perspective, groundwater is key to ensure equitable access for safe drinking water and sanitation, but also to realize the right to a healthy environment. Governments are expected to realize these rights through action plans or strategies, and of course through groundwater protection and aquifer recharge. So we clearly need to see more of those actions from governments at different levels all over the world, including in Sweden, and probably including the country where you all sit as well. Some other takeaway messages from the World Water Development Report and from us at SIWI are that the potential in groundwater resources is essential in meeting increasing global demands for water, especially during periods of severe water stress. The development of underexploited groundwater resources in places like sub-Saharan Africa offers opportunities for food security and economic growth, and of course for drinking water. Groundwater systems support valuable ecosystem and other services and can play a critical role in climate change adaptation and mitigation. Given its common pool nature, however, and to enable integrated water resources management, all data and information about aquifer systems and about groundwater should be made available publicly for everyone to draw from. And improved groundwater governance and management are needed to use it sustainably and avoid overexploitation and contamination. And here, just a note on governance and management. The World Water Development Report distinguishes between those two concepts and regards groundwater governance as something that takes place in the longer term and at an overarching level. It is about the decision-making processes. It is also about the good groundwater principles, including that concerned stakeholders should be able to participate on an equal, non-discriminatory basis in decision-making that concerns them. And this type of governance of groundwater and water resources in general should be aligned with day-to-day management operations on the ground. So the very decisions that, for instance, a well owner, a farmer has to take. And in conclusion, why should we care about invisible groundwater resources? Groundwater has vast potential. It's often poorly understood, consequently undervalued today. It is in many places mismanaged, even abused, because it is difficult to control it at the very ground. Human activities contribute to over-extraction, to pollution of groundwater in many places. And in other locations, we simply do not know how much groundwater is there below our feet. But there is solutions in drawing more on groundwater and making the invisible visible. It requires smart communication to enable this better understanding of topic, or indeed an element of the water cycle that is often dismissed as technical and complex to grasp. And with that, I say thank you, and you can find the report via this link. And there's also here a link to the World Water Day that took place on the 22nd of March, as always, this year. And the SIWI groundwater campaign can also be found on our website, and I encourage you to take a look at that and learn from what we have done in terms of communicating groundwater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thanks a lot. The link and the PowerPoint and everything will also be sent to you. So if you didn't take it down, or if it's just too much to copy and write, we will send it together with the other information, the YouTube link. All of that will come in a package, so don't worry about that. You were talking about learning more. First of all, any questions for Jenny? Please use our chat function, write down your questions so long, and I will convey them to her. But first, Jenny, if one is to visit World Water Week and want to learn about the groundwater and more about groundwater, will there be any more sessions, any special sessions?
There are so many sessions on groundwater this year, and I sit in the World Water Week Scientific Program Committee. And there, together with others, I am organizing 3 sessions as part of a seminar series. And they take place first as an online session in the first week, because of course this week, the World Water Week is 2 weeks. And then in the second week, we have 2 on-site sessions. All of those can be followed in one way or the other online as well, if you do not have the opportunity to come to Stockholm. And there are very many other sessions in the program as well. So do take a look online and search for groundwater.
Thank you very much. We have now a question here from Malak, and he writes, when we talk about shared groundwater aquifers in the MENA region, these are all protected by international treaties, but how can these aquifers be managed better and ensure the protection of these aquifers in terms of overexploitations?
Yeah, I didn't mention transboundary aquifers at all today, but there is plenty to say about those. Indeed, the World Water Development Report contains an entire chapter dedicated to transboundary aquifers and the collaboration and international cooperation that is needed over such aquifers. And there again, first, I just want to say that there's constantly more data and better information gained about such aquifers. I think today some 468 transboundary aquifers are mapped around the world, but most of them are not mapped to a great extent, so we don't know the details about them. Sometimes it's not even clear exactly what countries share a certain transboundary aquifer. But when it comes to the large ones, plenty of work is done, and there is a handful of agreements between countries over some of those. And there is also some legislation and other tools for governing of those aquifers jointly. But how to improve that? Better understanding of the the groundwater and how far the aquifers extend is of course very important. And there we simply need more research, and we need this important sharing of the data, because sometimes the data sits in a repository somewhere, but it's not shared with other countries. So that is one of the prerequisites for better collaboration over groundwater that is shared.
Thank you very much. And we have another question from Marissa. Is it possible that people help to monitor groundwater and the aquifer status, like social participations, such things like that? Or are there any social practices on it already?
Absolutely, a very good question. There are so many different practices that really go back in time. Elinor Ostrom, for instance, she reported on several of those, even I think back in her PhD thesis. So I think that's back in the 60s. She started looking at collective action around groundwater. And as a matter of fact, at least one of the sessions during the World Water Week this year will be devoted to collective action and how community-based and participatory monitoring of groundwater can look, and how it can be improved, and how we can learn from the very ground, from the users, from those who deal with groundwater management on an everyday basis. So indeed, there is much to learn from such initiatives. There's plenty of research on this. But again, I would say there is so much potential in participatory monitoring and ensuring to take into account and involve such users, the local and traditional knowledge that exists around groundwater. I could speak about this for a long time. It's a very good question, and yeah.
Thank you. I just needed to unmute myself as well. Micah writes, thank you very much for the presentation. Fair participation still is a major challenge. Any thoughts you could share regarding how we can ensure that poor and marginalized communities better benefit from the further development of groundwater resources? Maybe you know of any inspiring examples.
Ooh, thinking hard here. I would say that there are some examples coming from India, for instance, here. I really don't want to name any straight out on that, but really this is a little bit similar to the previous question, that if we do take into account users and local residents, some of whom have access to groundwater directly, or because they share or they purchase groundwater from a landowner, for instance, who has there's so much to do to ensure that marginalized groups are indeed having better access to groundwater. But in my own research, I have seen that it is underestimated how people, for instance, in slum areas, in peri-urban areas, in low-income areas, they rely on groundwater more or less entirely, because they are not being served by piped water distributions. They are not customers of a utility, because their slum areas are not connected to the network, for instance. And so they cope on an everyday basis by accessing groundwater in one way or the other. Plenty there. I could talk again for a long time.
Thank you. And thanks, Lucia, for bringing an example of participatory groundwater to the chat. Have a look at that link, everyone. Abdullah writes, is it possible that groundwater tank refill with short period of times with an external help?
Do you, by tank, do you refer to lakes and ponds as in India? Otherwise, I'm not sure what you mean by tanks. Please.
Abdullah, if you can please just clarify that in the chat. And what else do we have? While you do that, Abdullah, just clarifying what you exactly mean by tanks. I was curious to find out a little bit, Jenny. You were talking about developing groundwater use in Africa, and that it's possible at least in several of the countries, perhaps not all. What kind of development or investments is needed, or what you have in mind particularly?
Those investments can be everything from acknowledgement and support financially to small-scale drinking water systems. They can also be to support multi-purpose systems that are in use both for drinking water and domestic use, but also for cattle, for some irrigation, productive uses, basically. And the support here can be in terms of, as I said, just acknowledging that those systems are in place, that not everyone are having access to piped water, that groundwater is the resource that people go to. Sometimes in some areas, the groundwater is accessible by just digging a well, but in such shallow wells, you tend to, at least in urban, peri-urban areas, have more problems with water quality because of poor sanitation solutions. So that is also something in terms of health and safety that end users might need advice and recommendations around, for instance, point of use treatment, or how to ensure to recharge the resource so that it is sustainable, for instance, with rainwater harvesting.
Thank you very much. And then we have a question from Nanda. What would be the most obvious signs that general people can know, so that general people can know that our government is, or when our government is overusing or over contaminated or overusing our groundwater, or maybe pollute our groundwater, I'd say?
The major signs of that. Well, sometimes if groundwater is polluted or contaminated, users would not really know. In other instances, you could see, you could smell, and so on, that groundwater is polluted. And if groundwater is distributed by a government body or a water utility, it is their duty, of course, to ensure to treat the groundwater before it is distributed. But other signs of groundwater not being protected, well, there should be, for instance, upstream protection areas. Drinking water protection zones can be set aside in the landscape, ensuring that information is shared on what water sources are actually used for distributing drinking water. Could be some of those signs, and of course ensuring that regulatory laws and norms are updated based on the latest knowledge and so on.
Thank you so much. We have another suggestion here from Cecilia, who's also posted a link. Thank you very much for Cecilia and for sharing with everyone. And Abdallah has clarified, sorry for taking so long to respond. Yes, groundwater tanks such as lakes. So a quick reply to that previous question.
I believe the question was how we can, how groundwater can maybe be supported by tanks, something like that. So indeed, tanks, ponds, lakes, other types of landscape structures are important to ensure infiltration and recharge into to the aquifers. So ensuring that such surface water bodies are not silted up, that there isn't too much sedimentation that would hinder infiltration from the surface water body down into the aquifer is very important. And this is something that we're talking tanks in India, but you could equally look at the African continent again. For instance, I recently visited Ethiopia, and we went out on a lake that was heavily suffering from sedimentation. So it's becoming more and more shallow and sort of spreading out in the landscape, partially because, yeah, there's too much silt sitting at the bottom of the lake, and so groundwater recharge is arrested for that reason. So important to manage tanks and surface water body and see the interaction between that and groundwater.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much for being here with us and telling us more about this invisible resource. We learned so much more about from your presentation. And thank you everyone for participating in the chat and sharing links. It's really appreciated that we share from and with each other. It's now time to introduce our next speaker, Rick Hogeboom, who's also going to talk about some invisible water. Welcome to you. You're Executive Director for the Water Footprint Network, and you will give us a better understanding of our global water footprint, its impact, and how we better use and value the water. Over to you, Rick. Thanks a lot.
Yes, hello, thank you, and welcome everyone to this second session. And thanks, Girl and the team, for making this possible. I am trying to figure out all the screens here, but you should be able to see my slides now, right? Good, and I see a lot of nodding, so that means that you can hear me too, or you are expert in lip reading. But thanks a lot. I'm thrilled to be part of this this World Water Week Communications Initiative and to be speaking alongside some other water enthusiasts, because that really is how I see myself, mostly as a water enthusiast. Even though I will share some grim outlooks in parts of my presentation. But I am a water enthusiast, really. So I try to show that mostly by smiling a lot, but also indeed by leading the Water Footprint Network, which is an international knowledge center. We are based in the Netherlands, and we try to promote fair and smart use of the freshwater resources of the world, both ground and surface water. We do that using the water footprint concept. And we work with companies, with governments, with investors, and the general public to achieve that mission of fair and smart use water globally. I'm also an academic, a scientist. I'm researching the way humanity uses the Earth's precious but finite water resources and the impact that that has on the environment, on economies, and on societies. And it's really that scientific knowledge that feeds the Water Footprint Network and also hopefully public and private policies on water. And that is really what excites me about my dual role, because I really want to get the science, my science in general, on water use into policy on water use, in practice, in action, because that really is what is needed, as we will also see in a bit. So what I will do in the next 15 or so minutes is summarize well over 20 years of scientific research from the field of water footprint assessment. So that's peanuts, easy job. And I will cover 3 short blocks. First, I will look at what is a water footprint, the basics of water footprinting, to then move on to see what the impacts are of our water footprint and what we can do to avoid or to reduce some of the problems that occur because of it. And in doing so, I really hope that I can inspire you to improve the way in which we value water use. Now, you are a diverse audience, and your perspectives and knowledge on water will differ quite a bit, I'm sure. But what unites you is that you are all consumers in one way or the other. And that is a good thing, because one of the core ideas, or the central thesis, if you will, of water footprint assessment is that consumption of goods and services, all the stuff that we buy and consume, that consumption is the ultimate driver of water use, and therefore of water overexploitation and pollution. So consumption is the ultimate driver of water overexploitation and pollution. And since you and I are all consumers, I believe that it is particularly useful to meditate a bit on our water footprint. So not just as an abstract thing or a concept to write about, but really also in relation to our own personal lifestyles and consumption choices. So I will therefore first and foremostly address you as consumers in your role as consumers throughout my presentation. Now, let's cover a few definitions very shortly, because I don't want to lose your attention on the one hand, but it's also good to be on the same page. What do I mean precisely when I'm talking about a water footprint? A water footprint is an indicator of water use, but it's a special indicator. It's a fancy one. It's a multi-dimensional indicator. First, a water footprint provides us with a volumetric measure of water use. Remember that it's about volumes, about liters or cubic meters, or God forbid if we have Americans among us, in gallons, but still it would be expressed in volumes. It also refers to consumption. So that means the water that does not return to the same place and time where it was taken from, and it can therefore also not be used for something else in that place and time. So that's different from the traditional measures that you might see like withdrawal or abstraction. It's about consumption. And moreover, there are 3 colors of a water footprint, and the colors refer to the source that the water was taken from. We have the green, the blue, and the gray water footprint. Green water, and we will have a presentation after this one that focuses more on green, but green water refers to rainwater, water that falls onto the land and that evaporates back into the atmosphere right away. And that is the vital source for rain-fed agriculture. It's also the biggest component of our total water footprint. Blue water, that's the water you're probably more familiar with. It's the water in rivers, in lakes, in streams, but also in aquifers, groundwater, as the first presenter showed. That's also blue water, and it's what most people also think of when thinking about water that is used. It's blue water. It's the source for irrigation water, for industrial use, and also for the water that we use in and around the house. So that's what draws virtually all attention of all our water governance and of all our management policies. And that hardly ever covers green water. And lastly, there is the gray water footprint, which is a measure of pollution. And that indicates how much water will be needed to dilute a certain contaminant of water to acceptable levels. A water footprint thus brings together a quantity and a water quality component through the green and blue and the gray component of that water footprint. Continuing then, a water footprint also has, I already referred to it shortly, a space and time connotation to the water used. It matters when and where use takes place. A liter of water used in, say, well, Iran in summer will have a very different impact than that same liter of use will have in winter in, say, Sweden. And that also really sets a water footprint apart from, for instance, a carbon footprint where the location is not so relevant where the footprint occurred. The next point I find really important, and that is that a water footprint is always linked to a human activity. Yes, a water footprint, as I mentioned, is a measure of water use, but perhaps you can think of it better as a measure of water appropriation. It means how much water do we claim for our processes, for our activities, for our products? Or more simply put, it measures what share of the water pie we are claiming for ourselves as humans. And the last step I want to mention is that water footprints are accounted for at the lowest level of an individual activity or of a process. And you can add these up like building blocks to, for instance, the water footprint of a product. You need multiple steps to get to a product, and all steps in the value chain of a product need to be added together. So all the steps that use water, that pollute water, need to be counted towards the total water footprint of a product. But that aggregation doesn't need to go to the level of a product. You can also do it for producers or for companies or for events. Hey, SIWI, Water Week, what is the water footprint of the Water Week? You can calculate that for sure. Maybe that's a good idea to do once. You can also aggregate it to the level of a country or a river basin or to consumers, to us. Okay, enough with the definitions. Let me give you a few quick examples of product water footprints that you are probably familiar with or might be familiar with. A cup of coffee, maybe some of you are enjoying some right now. 132 liters for a small cup of coffee. Most of it green water, a little bit blue, a little bit gray. One of my favorites, chocolate, 17,000 liters per kilo. One of the most water intensive products that we have. Why do you think is chocolate so water intensive? That has to do with the fact that it's a tropical plant. It grows in the tropics. There's a large atmospheric demand for water there. So that's what's also been reflected in that large green component in the total water footprint. And one last example that you probably, if you are familiar with one of these numbers, have seen before, is beef, 15,000 liters global average water footprint. And I mentioned that we add these building blocks together, right, to get to the water footprints of products. So this 15,000 really need to be interpreted as the sum of the water that is needed for the cow to drink, the surfacing water on the farm, the water needed for processing and the slaughtering, and most importantly, the water needed to grow the feed of the cow. Now, I always have a bit of difficulty fathoming just how much water that really is. So just for reference, this is about 15,000 liters worth of water, a container about this size. Now, I also mentioned that we can do such calculations for the water footprint, not for a product, but for a consumer. Most people, when they think about their water footprint, will think first and foremost about the water that they use at home for washing, for cooking, for cleaning, right? And that is right, because that is water that we need in and around the house. And it's probably also what you get billed for. So that's probably the water use we value most if we talk about the topic of valuing water. However, our total water footprint includes, as I mentioned, all the water that is needed for the stuff that we buy, for the food that we eat, for the clothes that we wear. That water, however, is invisible typically to us as consumers. It's the water that is hidden in the products that are often produced and imported all the way from the other side of the globe. It is also the water that we do not get billed for, and that we therefore maybe also do not value. But okay, if that is the definition of a consumer water footprint, how much do you think it is? How much water do you think we use? Question for all of you. What is your water footprint? And I see you think, you may put it in the chat, just keep the number in your mind. The answer is really, it depends where you are from, but the global average consumer needs about 4,000 liters per person per day. 4,000 liters per person per day. That's quite a bit. And if you're relatively rich, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you qualify for that category, then you can easily double that amount. Then you can go to 8,000 liters per person per day. Much of that 4,000 liters needed to produce our food. Quite a bit for energy also, but food really is the major share for most people. And here you see an artist impression for the water footprint of a typical German diet and a typical Italian diet, expressed as the volume in the aquarium behind the people. And the differences between these two, 2,900 for a German or 4,800 for an Italian, is mostly explained by the higher animal product share in Italian diets, because animal products are relatively water intensive. I also mentioned that it is time and space specific where you use that water. So the map that you see here is a COVID spread map where the Dutch left the virus behind across the globe. Oh no, sorry, this is the Dutch water footprint laid out. So each location that shows yellow indicates that something is being produced there that the Dutch ultimately consume. I am Dutch, in case you hadn't noticed it. We source our strawberries from Spain. We get our soy to feed the cattle from Brazil. We get cotton from Central Asia. All of those locations use water for Dutch consumption. And what is also interesting to note is that 95%, so almost all of that water of the Dutch water footprint lies abroad, right? 95%. And that goes to show just how dependent we are on foreign water resources, on one another's water resources. And this doesn't just go for the Netherlands. This goes for many countries, even some very water rich ones as those in Western Europe. And that is actually quite particular if you think about it, that we have a lot of water, yet we depend for our consumption on a lot of water abroad. Okay. Well, you say very nice, Rick. So we're using a lot of water, 4,000 liters. It's spread around the world. So what? So what if my water footprint is 4,000 liters or 8,000? Well, let me give you just a glance of some of the problems that we are facing globally because of our collective water footprints. And I'll keep it short, both because of time, but also because I don't want to ruin your day. So if you're ready, then I have a few problems at the global level. Yeah. The first is that our water footprint is environmentally unsustainable. All red areas on this map indicate places where humanity collectively is using more blue water than we have sustainably available, blue water. It means that we are crossing critical ecological thresholds. We are using water in those locations at the expense of ecosystems, or we draw it from non-renewable groundwater sources. Or if you phrase it differently, it means that we are living off of our bank account in terms of water. And that comes at the cost of the environment. It comes at the cost of future generations. 4 billion people are living in these red areas. 4 billion people. It shows that our water footprint collectively is too large, and we need to reduce across the board to stay within the planetary boundary for water use. This is a map for blue water. We can draw similar maps for green water. Also, in many places, again, in the red ones, we use more green water than there is available, mostly, again, at the cost of nature. And for the gray or the pollution water footprint, the same goes. it is environmentally unsustainable. This map shows river basins and the pollution levels for phosphorus. All the red and orange ones are over the limit, so that's almost everywhere. And we can do that for thousands of other pollutants besides phosphorus as well, and the picture won't change that much. And let me give you a really quick but graphic illustration of what this environmentally unsustainable water footprint looks like in real life. This is a dead freshwater river dolphin from the Indus Basin in Pakistan. Now, why do I show you this particular dolphin, which by the way is highly endangered? I show it because water footprinting allows us to trace this dead dolphin back to Dutch consumption. Remember that map of Dutch consumption that I showed earlier? I overlaid that here with the scarcity map, and we find that almost half of our blue water footprint is located in unsustainable regions, and that most of the Dutch unsustainable share, the dark red places here, is located in Pakistan. Why Pakistan? Because the Dutch source a lot of their sugar from sugarcane that is produced in Pakistan. The blue water footprint of sugarcane drains the rivers, and I think it goes without saying that fish and dolphins alike prefer water over land, over dry land to live in, right? And the gray water footprint related to excess fertilizer use in sugarcane production destroys habitats from this endangered dolphin too. Sugarcane that we import to Europe and turn into the sugar that may have ended up in the cookie that I just ate or in the sugar that I drank with the coffee I just had. Because we understand our water footprint, because we can trace our water consumption and pollution back to the original locations, we know when and where that consumption leads to such environmentally unsustainable situations. Okay, time does not allow me to go into full detail in the next maps, but I'll just show that our global water footprint is also highly inefficient. Some producers really need much more water, even under the same conditions, to produce something than others do. And we found that if we just get the worst producers to reduce or improve their footprint to the level of what the best producers can do, and not even the best, but like the reasonably good ones, the 1 in 4 best, that we can already save 40% of our water resources. 40%. That really will get us a long way, and it just shows how much water we are wasting basically needlessly. The third issue that I want to address is that our global water footprint is also very inequitably distributed. We already saw that we are dependent on one another's resources through virtual water trade, through trade in products, and therefore water also has become a really global resource. Yet some countries or consumers in countries, so let's make it a bit more personal, use much more of that global resource through their lifestyles than others. And that is indicated in this graph in per capita water footprints of large countries. We also see the global average water footprint indicated by the red line. And what is interesting to note here is that this average is already above what we consider environmentally sustainable. In other words, we need to embark on a collective effort to reduce our water footprints to within sustainable limits. But the top consumers really also need to reduce even more for equity reasons. Okay, what can we do then to reduce those various impacts of our water footprint? How can we better value water use for good? And I really wish that I could give you, I know there are communicators, journalists among you, I wish I could just give you a short list of actions and get it done with, right? But I think that I've shown that water use and its impacts are really multi-headed monsters that have spread over the entire globe, and that there is therefore no silver bullet, right? There is no silver bullet to reduce our water footprint to a level at which it is both sustainable environmentally, and it is efficient, and it is fair. That really is a shared responsibility. All stakeholders will have to play a role. And we really have some good ideas, we think, for all of those stakeholders. But as I said, I will address you first and foremostly in your role as consumer. So also from that capacity, there's a responsibility and something you can do. So what can we do as a consumer? You can shorten your showers. It will save you about 50 liters a day. So do it, really, saves a lot of water. You may even also save more if you count in the water that was needed to heat up the energy, to produce the energy that was needed to heat up the water. So actually, it's best if you take a cold, short shower or group showers, up to you. However, We also saw that most of our water footprint relates to our diets, particularly diets, our lifestyle, and particularly our diet. So skip your burger, reduce your meat intake. It really helps. The data are really strong on this. A vegetarian diet is on average 40% lower or smaller than a carnivorous diet, and a vegan diet is even lower still. It really is about the choices that you make while shopping, not just for foodstuffs, but also for other products and for clothing. Buy the high quality stuff so you don't need to replace it that often, so it doesn't need or pollute water to produce. Or buy a more water sustainable alternative, a bit more water sustainable version of a product. But then I hear you ask, how will I be able to make that choice? How can I choose a more water sustainable version of a product? It's often not on a label, right? It's often unknown. We need that transparency. We need that information from the companies, from the producers who make the products. And you, if you're a little bit more in the activistic consumer side, you might also advocate for that type of information to become available so that you can make an informed decision, which you now cannot. I also add 2 slides with some highlights for government and for companies, what they could do, but for the sake of time, I will just give them for reference because I know the slide deck will be shared. I won't cover them right now, but I do want to spend a few last words on that last point here for companies, which is on the role of investors, as it also, I think, quite directly links to the topic of valuing water. As a consumer, again, we're consumers using services from banks and pension funds ourselves. Do you know if your bank, do you know if your pension fund is funding water destructive activities with your money? Do you know that? I believe that investors are really an overlooked actor in the water domain, not just to fund solutions, but really to also enable the solving of problems, because their power may well be leveraged to push producers and companies in the right direction in terms of their water use, simply because to many companies, money speaks louder than anything. So as a consumer, as a client, you may want to ask your bank or pension funds how they're doing in the water sphere. I hope that I have puzzled you a little bit with a lot of information that I just gave you about our water use, or water footprint. And I started this presentation explaining that a water footprint is a very useful indicator of water appropriation, how much water we need to, and we can calculate that for products, for businesses, but also for ourselves as consumers. I showed that the collective water footprint of humanity is unsustainable. We use and pollute too much water at the expense of nature and at the expense of future generations. We waste enormous amounts of water by inefficient production practices. We do not share Earth's water resources fairly, with conflict and human suffering as a result. And at the same time, we are more dependent than ever on one another's water resources because of trade, making water a truly global resource. We're also, I think we are all familiar, right, with the fact that too much water causes floods, and the crises that come suddenly can easily be captured in pictures, in media outlets, and they make better headlines than water scarcity, even though I tried to come up with some graphic pictures of water scarcity and water related stuff. Because scarcity and related water problems that arise because of too little water, those are crises that build up over time, often gradually. They are misery in slow motion. Misery in slow motion. And because of that, they are easily overlooked, but we should not overlook them. And one of my favorite quotes that I like to use is by the 16th century preacher Thomas Fuller, who said, "We never know the worth of water until the well is dry." So let's not be so stubborn to wait till all of Earth's wells have gone dry. Let's address our unsustainable water footprints now through our own lifestyle choices and through your disseminating powers and your professional roles. So let's value water use such that we can go from scarcity to abundance.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rick. Thanks a lot for that presentation. A lot to think about, a lot of new information, a lot of very interesting maps. Sakib says, how can we spoke about gray water, green water, and blue water. Sakib is more interested in the gray water, and how can we eliminate the gray water footprint since it consists of pollutions? What do you say?
I think we can go a long way in reducing our gray water footprint. There are, of course, different sectors within society that use water and that pollute water. So if you think about the gray water footprint related to industrial use, then I think that transitioning to a circular economy eventually will mean a zero gray water footprint, right? Because you do not leave water dirtier in the river systems or in the water systems than you found it. You can, the technology is available to clean the water sufficiently so you don't cause the pollution in the first place. Whether or not that's cost effective is a different story, but technologically in industry and even in households, I believe that we can greatly reduce that gray water footprint and even go to zero. In agriculture, it's probably a little bit more difficult, especially if it relates to, for instance, the use of fertilizers. Some of that will leach out if you don't apply it well. So I think that reducing it is definitely possible, for instance, through more organic agricultural practices or more precision farming, so you don't overuse so that the excess leaches out to water systems. But there it will be harder to really go to a circular mode of production and therefore a zero footprint.
Thank you. Thank you. Mike really liked, and with a lot of us, liked the map showing the external footprint of the Netherlands and wonders if there are more maps or such maps available for most countries, and in that case, how they can be found and if they can be used freely. Do you know anything about that, Rick?
Yes, that's maybe a very straightforward question with a somewhat more complicated answer. The data is there, but to make it into a map that I showed requires a little bit of effort. But yes, the data is available through the Water Footprint Network. So, but if you really want them in the format that I have them, it makes sense to drop me a message because it needs a bit of twitching with the data.
Thank you. Thank you, Mikey, you got that. And everyone else, thank you very much. And also from Lucia, we have a few questions that I hope that we will be able to get through. Thank you very much for the presentation, Rick. First questions, is part of your mission at the Water Footprint Network changing behavior when it comes to consumers, producers, regulators, or if yes, how do you go about it? And if no, we go to the next question.
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, we don't care at all. No, clearly. And as I mentioned, it really is a shared responsibility where I believe every actor or actor group holds some piece of the puzzle to solving some of these issues. I try to address you now mostly as consumers, and that's also how through the Water Footprint Network we have developed all kinds of calculators where you can dial in some of your consumption patterns and then it will spit out a number of how much water you use. So in that sense, we also try to reach the general public in their role as consumer, but we really try to target everyone, from companies to improve the efficiency of their processes, to companies to set the right regulation in place to lower the depletion and the pollution. And increasingly much, I should say, also financial institutions, right? Because there's also for them an interest to reduce the risk that they are facing because all these water problems that are posing to their bottom line. But mostly, at least from my interest, because they really are enablers of activities that use and pollute water, even without them knowing that they do so. So yes, we target all of them, and maybe also in the light of the Stockholm Water Week that's upcoming. At the latest COP, we launched a declaration, the Glasgow Declaration on Fair Water Footprints, and that's really a multi-agency initiative where we bring the companies, the national the investors, the national companies, national governments together to really make water footprints fair along all those trade chains that cover our globe.
Thank you. There are quite a few more questions. I hope that we won't have time to answer them everyone now. I hope you're okay, Rick, if I send you the questions, if you can answer them briefly, I can send them out to the participants afterwards. Is that all right?
Of course, by all means. Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I like there's being a lot of engagements. That's fantastic. There's just one question that ties up with what you were talking about, calculators, and it's also from Lucia, and she wants to know, I would like to take that right away. How does your method to calculate water footprint compare to other water accounting methods? But most of all, we all would like to know, why are there so many different calculators?
Are there really that many different calculators? There are a
or
few
accounting methods?
Yeah. Good question. I think we were first. Does that count?
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, then we go with that. We are unfortunately running out of time. Thank you very much, Rick, for coming. For all of you
My pleasure.
who didn't have their questions answered here live, I'll send the questions to Rick, and he has promised to send it in writing, and I will then distribute it to all of you so that we don't miss out. Moving on in the program, Lan Wang-Erlandsson, researcher at Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. You will be our next presenter. Welcome very much to the World Water Week Communications Initiative 2022. And Lan will talk to us more about freshwater and how freshwater can help us achieve the Paris Agreement. Over to you, Lan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll try to share screen. Good afternoon, at least from my Stockholm time zone. So I'm a researcher at the Planetary Boundaries Research Lab, working in a project called Earth Resilience in the Anthropocene. Recently, we released a paper on a planetary boundary for green water. So in which we find that, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out the technology here. Do you see my screen? Yes, okay, now it's full screen as well. So yeah, and so I work with the Earth system perspective, and I'm also co-author of the forthcoming report in collaboration with SIWI and others, in which we look at the role of freshwater for climate mitigation. So in this report, we came up with 5 key messages. We find that climate change mitigation depends on freshwater. Climate change mitigation measures are important for impacting freshwater, and nature-based solutions are very important for mitigating climate change while delivering on multiple benefits. We also point out that water management, managing the wastewater and the water sector can also be very important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also that joint water climate governance need to be coordinated and strengthened. I'll be focusing in this talk on the 3 first key messages, given the time constraint and also my own expertise and research. So before we delve into the, in order to understand why climate mitigation also intertwined with the water cycle, it's good to unpack a little bit why freshwater is such a fundamental part of the Earth system, just realizing all these intertwinements. You're probably very familiar already with the global hydrological cycle, driven by the energy from the sun, evaporation rises from the ocean, but also from land, transport and falls precipitation, and runs out to the oceans. This, what is not shown here is also that the land itself also mediates the water cycle. And in fact, 40% of the precipitation over land comes from land itself. So this very intertwined movement on land, ocean, it's not just the water, but it also makes the water an essential part of the Earth system, moving around nutrients. This is a simplified figure of how the water cycle interacts with the rest of the Earth system. And it's still so complicated because water is so inherently interlinked with the energy balance, water being an energy flow in itself, water being clouds that impact and influences the albedo and reflectance of the solar energy. And all the human pressures in terms of pollution, into the atmosphere with aerosols, impact the cloud formation, and also land system changes influences how much soil moisture we have in available for both terrestrial system, our production systems, and downstream surface water, rivers, and groundwater. And all of this is so tightly interlinked, which means that on the other side of the coin is that the mitigation measures also intrinsically depend on water. If we look at the global carbon emission cycle that has been soaring since the Great Acceleration, this is showing from 1970, and I achieving the goals that we set up for ourselves in the Paris Agreement, the 2-degree scenario or the 1.5 degree scenario, we need to clearly cut the global emissions very steeply at a rate of 4% for the 2-degree or up to 8% per year for the 1.5 degree scenario. To do this, we need to not only cut the fossil fuel use and change our land use so that the land use change doesn't release more emissions, but we also need the help from the biosphere carbon sinks and eventually also create human carbon sinks to draw down that emission. So they come down to well below 2 degrees. And all of these actions are what we call mitigation measures in the that all requires water in one way or another, more or less directly. In the IPCC report, multiple mitigation measures and their potential contributions are listed per sector. We could see, for example, that wastewater reductions is listed among because to reduce the greenhouse gas emission from untreated wastewater, transport using bioenergy that needs water to grow, and the biggest mitigation potential are in the AFOLU, that is the land sector, so afforestation, so agriculture, forest and land use sector. This includes agriculture management, to use it to sequester carbon, afforestation, restoration, and also preventing deforestation and other degradation of land. And in the energy sector, we have hydropower that directly use water, but also things like nuclear, geothermal also uses water for the industrial processes. And then we have BECCS, which is the bio energy carbon capture and storage, which is also using by growing forest, growing trees, and then capturing it to remove carbon, such as a negative carbon technology uses large amounts of water to provide for those plantations or trees. However, what we see is that we already have a increasing impact. So we already see that decreases in precipitation are leading to a loss in the tropical forest carbon sink, and the future trajectory will depend on how much of the forest protection, restoration, and also the fire and drought related mortality we can prevent, whether we will have a complete switch of the tropical forest from being our friends that absorb our emissions to being a foe that releases emissions and further contributes to climate change. So with that, I think we're ready to dive into the mitigation measures to impact water. So we see that mitigation measures in the land system, impacted in the land system, directly influences both blue water and green water. These changes are unevenly distributed across land. So in yellow, you see that blue water discharge are places that have been decreasing due to reservoir, due to hydropower, due to climate change itself, and then green water, that is the changes in soil moisture that has been decreasing, notably over in South America, for example, due to climate change and also agriculture use, but also increasing in, say, India due to irrigation. IPCC reports also note that these extremes in heavy precipitation, in agriculture and ecological droughts have been on the rise and will continue to increase due to climate change. So the climate change effects are impacting on the water cycle, which then goes back to itself. So this is a schematic to show how various human pressures, and not only greenhouse gas emissions, which we primarily associate perhaps with climate change, but also other human actions, including aerosol emissions, pollution, and land use change, land degradation, and water withdrawal affect the water cycle, which results in response across the Earth system, not just the water cycle, but also in terms of atmospheric dynamics, how circulation changes. It could delay the monsoon. You could mediate a nutrient cycle, nitrogen cycle. It leads to ecosystem changes and hydrological changes, of course, which have then aggregated up to Earth system resilience impact, which then also impact itself, so that we have a feedback loop of mitigation measures with water. This means that nature-based solutions are very well suited to have multiple benefits, if you wish, because they can hit on, as you see here, that well, many different human pressures, not only single one, that the nature-based solutions tend to be able to address several of these human pressures at the same time. We can see this more clearly. So nature-based solutions, for example, in continue to let the vegetation work for us. We see that the permafrost soils in the vegetation are actually much bigger reserves of carbon than the gas, oil, and coal reserves combined. The vegetation, terrestrial vegetation, also make us a big favor by taking up the carbon emissions. It's about a fourth of the total anthropogenic emissions. We also have the land use that currently emits a large share, stands for a large share of our total anthropogenic emissions, which we can prevent by preventing deforestation, protecting the remaining forest. Estimates there are various estimates, and they're all certain uncertainties to it, but they tend to show that forests are have the singularly biggest mitigation potential, followed by grassland agriculture and a protection of coastal areas and peatlands. However, in wetlands area, we see that wetlands already declined over the past decades by more than a third, and 15% of the world's peatland have been drained for agriculture, forestry, and grazing. So these are the causes, contributing causes to that land use is a anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission source. This stands for about 5% of the total anthropogenic emissions. With regard to land system change, IPCC assess that about 30 to 50% of the planet's land, marine systems, and freshwater need to be protected. This is nowhere near, or the areas of protected zones that we have today are nowhere near these numbers. So we have a long way to go here. As we see, ecosystem, they contribute to carbon sequestration, storage, but also the mix up with other effects such as albedo, so how much of the solar energy that's reflected back. They have multiple benefits because they're also used for adaptation to floods, to stabilize shorelines and mitigate climate change effects such as increasing in drought and heat waves. They also provide multiple critical services, including providing clean air, water, food, fuel, medicines, and genetic resources. And many such global and local estimates have been made where restoration, for example, other suggested nature-based solutions can have multiple benefits, not just carbon. So these areas are possible to identify. We also have similar priority areas for proactive protection so that we can prevent the forest turning from friends to foe in terms of carbon. So these methods are out there. Of course, these more global estimates need to consider that they are often potential. So when it comes to actual implementation of mitigation measures, the local perspectives are very important. I just want to mention that, as there are so many global maps out there. So often when you see this total mitigation potential, it really is a potential and not necessarily implementable. It also needs to account for the local context. So with that, we return to the key messages, and I hope that this short presentation helped unpack a little bit how these key messages come about. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask now or contact me later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lan. Do we have any questions from the audience so far? No, just feel free to write in the chat if there's anything you would like to have clarified or anything that you'd like Lan to go through again. I mean, we gathered here a lot of journalists and communicators together trying to be better communicators, increase reporting on water. What would you suggest? I mean, how would it, to convince decisions maker about the importance of fresh water, what would you like to see from our sides as journalists and communicators?
So I take an Earth system perspective here, and often we have a need to both balance the local need, the immediate need of the water problems that we face. And maybe I didn't attend all the talks that Rick just presented, but here all these water scarcity that are immediate needs, but also this longer term need to protect our forest and the role of water for keeping those large scale Earth system components in place to ensure that they don't tip over. I think that's very important and not to be forgotten in when we protect our forests, that they do not only serve the immediate water needs, but also the long-term security of the planet.
Thank you. Lucia is asking here, thank you, Lan, for the presentation. I thought I heard you say that carbon stored in water sources is greater than the carbon stored in fossil fuels. Is that correct? I think also it was mentioned in the picture on the global carbon cycle. Is that correct, Lan?
So not in water, well, in ocean, it's huge, of course, but let me show. So I meant the carbon stock in permafrost areas, in soil, organic carbon, in wetlands, in vegetation, in the biomass itself is larger than the reserve. So if we would burn everything that we have in terms of the organic biomass that we have, that will clearly release more than. But for now, the permafrost are still okay, but we will see how long that lasts, of course. But I don't think estimates are saying that all of that is going to be released.
Right, but we do hear that the permafrost is, do you say melt?
Thawing, yes, they are thawing, and that's clearly very worrying. And one of the reasons that we consider the planetary boundary for freshwater change to now be transgressed.
Right, and but we don't know how quickly it goes.
There are estimates. It's very difficult and many uncertainties. Some of these local areas also change quite abruptly, from my understanding. So I'm not a permafrost researcher, but from my understanding, it is a very worrying area, and they don't think that there is one tipping point for the entire permafrost, but there are many local abrupt shifts within the permafrost regions, which makes it also difficult to monitor and measure. So it's not a linear change within the soil systems.
Right, thank you. Abubakar writes, hello from Afghanistan. Thank you very much for your presentation, Lan. Can you please share your insights related to nature-based solutions in arid and semi-arid regions?
Oh, that's a big, and maybe could you email me and maybe I can get back to that question. I found that maybe the question is a little bit broad for me to answer.
Sure.
Yes.
Abubakar, I will do like that, as with some of the questions from Rick, I will email this to Lan, and she will then answer in writing. So and then I will share, of course, with everyone. And then we'll take that question from there. I hope that's all right. Yes, Mike, we will share, Mike is asking to share digital copies of the speakers' presentations. We will be sharing the PowerPoints with all from all the speakers with you, unless someone of the presenters has asked us not to, but we will share the PowerPoints so that you will have that and will be able to go through it again. I was wondering, Lan, in your recent study and in this most recent report, was there anything that really surprised you more than anything else? What surprised you the most in your findings?
Yes, I think what particularly surprised and worries me is one of the figures that I showed of how the carbon sink strengths in the tropical forest have peaked, not only in Amazon, but also in the pantropical, also in Africa. And this is based on observations, and they also did not match with the Earth system model predictions. So they also compared in the study their observation with the Earth system models, and it did not match. So while the Earth system models were showing an increase in the carbon sink strengths in the tropical forest, observations showed the opposite. It's not to say that the observations are absolute truth. Sometimes observations can also be uncertain, of course, but it's truly worrying to see that the tropical forests are already turning against us because of the forest mortality, because of decreases, changes in hydroclimate and deforestation, which the Earth system models are clearly then, if this is true, that they do not capture it. This is one of the more highlights I find worrying.
And you spoke about some solutions, but are they quick solutions? Are there any quick solutions? I guess there are not, but if you would list the priority of solutions that you think should be implemented, what would that list look like?
Yes, I mean, of course, we have these absolute solutions that could be done quickly, that should be done, including, I mean, the wastewater management that I did not talk about, that has so many benefits, both socially and for climate mitigation and for the ecosystems, but also some of the more upstream that are not maybe directly linked to it. Say diet shift, for example, has a huge implications for deforestation, for land use change. So surprisingly, changes in, say, the food system, reducing food waste, eating less meat, have very important factors, and also just stop using fossil fuel. The fossil fuel impact on water is immense. So reducing some of these demand side pressures immediately, I think are very important. But in this report, we of course also point at, I mean, if you look at the IPCC mitigation potential, the biggest reductions are in an immediate stop in deforestation, immediate halt of wetlands destructions, and restoring these systems.
Thank you. And before we let you go, what about technical solutions?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit what it calls technical, like BECCS, the bioenergy capture, carbon capture and storage is a technical solution, could be seen, and it has a high potential, but it also uses water, and in some cases you also need to irrigate these plants, at least if you were going to fulfill the full mitigation potential. So there are some issues there, and of course there are other like technical issues, technical solutions also related to water treatment that can be rolled out very immediately. Sometimes it's just a matter of financing. So a lot of cases I think that the technology is in place, but the political will and the finance, directing the finance to those solutions are very important as well, if that helps.
Yeah, and I guess finance and political will is much harder to try and sway sometimes. Thank you very much, Lan. If we don't have any more questions there in the chat, I'll send you the outstanding question that I will then convey to everyone in writing. I've also got a request if you would like to share, if you have any social media or any social media contact with the participants, you can send it to me and I can also share that with everyone. We also have an additional input here from Rick. For everyone, thank you very much, Rick, for contributing to the chat. Thank you, Lan. We now invite the next and final speaker of the day. And we have Sumit Vij, Senior Researcher at the University of Geneva from Geneva Water Hub. Sumit, are you with us? I saw you just now.
Hi, Gerald.
Hey, there you are.
I'm very much here.
You are very much. No, I've seen you've been following the program. Thank you very much. And welcome to the Communications Initiative. Sumit is going to speak about water conflicts, cooperation, and the third alternative, which I'm very curious about what that can be. Sumit, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarell. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking to such a nice audience. They've been very proactive, so it's fantastic to be around such people. And also some of the past speakers were very insightful, so I've also learned a lot from them. I'm going to share the screen now. We don't have much time. So here we go. Can we see the screen? I'll just make it a full screen now. Is it better? Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. Again, welcome. I know afternoon sessions can be challenging, but I'm sure you must be having some cups of coffee to survive this. Today's topic, it's very different from the last two speakers. I'm going to speak more about the politics and more about water conflicts and cooperation. And as Uriel mentioned, the third alternative, and we'll quickly dive into. But let's just look at what's the menu for us today. So just three things which I really want to highlight today. The first one is to look into this whole broad and very diverse topic of water conflicts and cooperation. Several theoretical perspectives. I'll try and make them as simple as possible to present. And what are the key arguments they make around them and how they are different? What is this whole thesis about water war? What are the antitheses to water wars? What is water diplomacy in a way? And what is the third alternative? What are we really missing? And where could really media play a very important role in this? And the third alternative is specifically about the frozen conflicts and non-decision making, which is part of this larger conflict cooperation continuum. A lot of times we have a big focus on conflicts and then we report on them. There's also a big focus on cooperation when two states come together to discuss about water issues, but somehow we kind of miss out on the politics of what happens in between these conflicts and cooperations. To give you a very quick example, in the Mekong River Basin, it took them 37 years to bring the entire Mekong River Commission. But what happened in that 37 years is a very interesting story in itself, and that's where the politics lies. And I think sometimes it's very valuable to notice them, to notice these, to report these instances. And this is where I would go into the second point of where media could play a very important and a big role there. Of course, they don't have to work alone. They have to work with scientific community, but also people who are experts on the topic, work with them, see what is important, what can be reported, how can conflicts be converted into positive cooperation and not the destructive cooperation. And the last part of my presentation, I would just quickly take you through an example of a science media diplomacy project where we kind of highlighted what role or how media has been reporting on one of the crucial river basins in South Asia, where it has missed the puzzle or where it has really focused on, and what it means for the citizens as well as the politicians or the political actors or larger stakeholders of the Brahmaputra Basin. So without wasting time, let's start with some of the key arguments on water conflicts first. So there has been, since the mid-1980s, a big discussion, and this is where the whole water wars thesis finds its genesis, by this report from, or especially this article from Naff and Matson in 1984. They kind of predicted that there will be water wars, and this was specifically focused on the Middle Eastern region. It was further substantiated by a report from US Foreign Policy on water resources. It also means that the US was interested in water resources, and they kind of made this very important claim, I would say an interesting claim for the Middle East, that water would replace oil as a dominant issue for regional instability. I think that really triggered this whole narrative of water wars and the entire globe. It didn't stop there. It continued in different regions, especially, but focusing on the Middle East. And then there was various articles and making an antithesis of water wars, but also supporting that argument. And Stephen Pelletier, he wrote an article in New York Times specifically making an argument for the US armed forces to capture not just the oil reserves during the invasion, but also kind of capture the water resources. Although he made a positive story about it, he argued that if we could capture the extensive irrigation system in Iraq, it would help the entire Middle East to come out of water scarcity issues. And those were the kind of the narratives which were used in the mid-1980s till the late or mid-2000s to talk about water wars, particularly, not so much about water conflicts as such. And this kind of narrative spread from the Middle East to South Asia or Southeast Asian countries also. In South Asia, particularly, there is in South Asia, the countries like India, China, Pakistan, who have territorial issues, the narrative of water wars could fit very well. And some of the authors or strategists, I would say, Brahmachelani, they kind of still make an argument that China is escalating a water war in South Asia, and its new hydropower project is kind of going in the direction and will bring water war on the borders between India and China. Of course, there are antitheses to that. People have argued, I might specifically have written about it, that there will be no water war between India and China. But these arguments have been existing, and it's been reported in the media. Now let's look at some of the antitheses to these arguments on water wars. And I think it's very important to see the difference between water conflicts and water wars. Water wars particularly bring two states together who are on a different standpoint, and it becomes a militarized aspect between them. However, water conflict may not result into that, and that's the key difference between the two arguments. And Homer Dixon in 1994 said that all the anthropogenic scarcity of water will lead to water conflicts. Of course, again, there has been agreements and disagreements on that, and the hydrohegemony framework from Mark Zitoun and Jeroen Warner kind of disagrees with that, saying that it's more about the politics. There will be no wars on water, but there will be more politics around it. And I think we need to look into those aspects of it. The questions of power are more important rather than making this linear connection between water, anthropogenic scarcity of water and linking it to water conflicts. This was further substantiated by the twins framework from Naho Mirumachi. She kind of come up with this argument that conflicts and cooperation are in continuum, they are interlinked. And if there are no conflicts, there will be no cooperation required, of course. And she made this an interesting example, taking the Ganges River basin in India, but also in the Mekong, and showed how this worked out, how conflicts and cooperation are in a continuum, and there is a continuous interaction between the two aspects. To get it a more nuanced understanding on water conflicts, there are people or scholars like Laila Mehta. She argues that scarcity or water scarcity, which might lead to conflicts, are a socio-political construction of how we manage or how we don't govern our resources. If you look at more domestic level, if you particularly take an example of India, if you see the class divide, the caste divide, that leads to water scarcity. People from lower caste may not receive enough water, but people from higher caste may receive it. People from higher class may receive water. Rick was talking about if you are from a rich country, 8,000 liters is enough for you, but if we connect or we talk about people from poor or developing countries, the 4,000 is enough. Also creates the notion of scarcity, and that may lead to conflicts. But it's also about the mismanagement and lack of governance. I think that's a bigger question which is still to be addressed, and that's why we go in the direction that we need to do water governance. This is where we kind of define, redefine, look into the nuances of how can we protect, conserve, how do we govern our water resources better. And if we look into further nuance in terms of transboundary waters, this goes beyond the question of water. This goes maybe to the historical disputes. In South Asia, there are multiple river big basins like the Indus, Brahmaputra, Ganges, and they flow through various territories, which are disputed in a lot of ways. And it's not per se because of the war or challenge on these rivers to cooperate is not simply because of water resources per se, it's because of the territory, it's because of the land. It's all about the historical conflicts which the countries have had in the last 5 decades or so. And that is the reason for conflict between them, not per se because of the water. So that nuance is very important to understand, to even understand water conflicts or respond to them. And of course, with the changing scenario, the requirement of water has gone up across the world, the amount of food consumed with the development aspects, the energy consumption, we need more water. And therefore, each country has their own sociopolitical interests to meet. And that also leads to these kind of conflicts per se. The demand for water has gone up. Rick was also kind of mentioning in those aspects. It's all about consumption, and that has gone up. Now let's quickly look into what are the key past arguments on water. We talked about this whole aspect of water wars in the past, Ryan Naff and Strom, but this was completely challenged by the study from Yoffe and Aaron Wolf in 1999, and they said this is wrong. There is more cooperation if we look at all the 270 odd river basins. There are more treaties signed between the countries. There is more data exchange. They are trying to cooperate. So that means there is more cooperation than conflicts, which also means there is no sense of water war going to happen. So they completely challenge this idea of water wars and water conflicts. And basins where conflicts over water have occurred, it only relates to the quantity of water and infrastructure. So it is not per se about the water itself, but it's also about water infrastructure. And that is also kind of claimed in some of the South Asian river basins, especially between India and China. That's very, very common. But also they came, I think, Peter Gleek and the new database with the Pacific Institute, they also kind of come up with this whole idea. And they talk about historically, there has been no water war since 2500 BC. And they gave this interesting example of city-states of Umma and Lagash over the use of Tigris River. And since then, there has been no militarized conflict. However, now what is more happening is that there is a weaponization of water happening, and there are several examples of that. The recent invasion of Taliban, or now the government in Afghanistan, they are talking about, they had a notion of attacking the Friendship Dam in Afghanistan. Ukraine and Russia war talks about shutting off the local resources, especially to control and to contain the military of the opposing state. In the Middle East, we have seen several examples of how water has been weaponized. But I again would argue that weaponization of water and the water infrastructure is quite different than the water wars. The states are not literally coming to the border with the military to fight against the water which is theirs or somebody else's. And that's a different kind of an argument. Moving to more cooperative or water cooperation arguments, there's a very interesting argument by Konka, and this has been looked by various people, especially in SIWI in Sweden. They're looking at the effective water management can lead to process of peace building. So water can be or possibly an instrument of peace building. That's another level of going ahead from water cooperation to water peace or water for peace. However, there's very little evidence for that at this point of time, maybe in future. And some of the cases, like the case of Kosovo, where where a detailed study has been done. They're saying that the management has to include both technical and political nuances. If you only build infrastructure, if you only limit yourself to water sharing, water delivery, that is not sufficient to build peace in areas which are militarized, where they have militarized conflicts in person. Now, taking this argument a bit further in terms of what is the current arguments about diplomacy, water cooperation is also not water diplomacy. Water diplomacy is a new term which is now emerged in the last 5 to 7 years. And what does it talk about? And to give you a very quick example, that cooperation is mostly technical, on technical aspects of water sharing, hydrometeorological data sharing, all those aspects. But diplomacy is beyond that. Diplomacy is more about socio-political and economic negotiations, which is going beyond the water box. And I think that changes the entire nuance of water diplomacy from water cooperation. Also, water diplomacy does not include state-to-state interaction, which is at the track 1 level. It also includes track 3, where the role of media comes into, where the role of academics come into, role of civil society comes into, role of even public come into there. And I think that has to be further enhanced to improve the relationship between the states, especially which share water resources or other forms of natural resources. And water diplomacy pushes for that idea. And I think it's a good way. So there are various examples, like in the Mekong, apart from MRC, which is the so-called authority for Mekong for the entire Mekong River Basin. There's also Council for Security Cooperation in Asia Pacific and Mekong, which looks into the knowledge creation and how they can use that knowledge to improve decision making. There's also Brahmaputra Dialogue, which is a completely informal water diplomacy track, which works from track 3 level to track 1.5, where I'm also part of. And we look into how these negotiations happen between the states to influence each other. However, there are also questions about what is track 1 diplomacy and are they successful? Are the only way to find success between the states to find peace or some sense of cooperation? Indus Water Treaty, for example, has been there since 1916 between India and Pakistan. It has survived 3 wars. But is it still relevant with the changing climate, with this whole new dimension of more demand for water, more consumption of water? Maybe not. And I think there's a big question mark on them. Same goes for Ganges Treaty, which is up for renewal in next 2 years. In 2026, there will be a new Ganges Treaty. How will they negotiate? Will climate change be a big factor in that? Will the demand and consumption of both the countries, which is not the same as when it was signed in 1996, will it change? Same goes for issue, if you talk about the Nile River Basin or the Nile Basin Initiative or Nile Basin Discourse, which kind of, I would say, fell apart, especially because there was a more focus at the track 1 level diplomacy. And I think that makes it very, very interesting to think about these questions of water cooperation and water diplomacy. Now, very quickly, I will go to the third alternative, which talks about what are we missing in terms of this larger debate of water conflicts and water cooperation or water peace or water wars. I think we're really missing on the politics of it. We are really not looking into why there is such a long delays for people, for states to come together to find peace, or there is a conflict more or less. And I think we need to find ways to move out, especially when the river basins are stuck in a rut, when there is a status quo there. Status quo particularly is maintained for 2 reasons. One is for political gains, because if they talk about more sensitive issues like water between India and Pakistan or India and China, they might lose power domestically. So there is also that nuance that particularly they push for status quo to stay in power, to move, to continue, to remain in power for a longer period of time, and for the larger political advantage per se. And there are several examples for that. So if you look at the current situation in the Nile Basin between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, although they went to the Security Council to discuss the JERD, which is the Grand Ethiopian Resonance Sudan, they haven't been able to find real answers to it, or maybe they have, it's not being come out, and there is a kind of a stalemate situation between the 3 countries. And of course, media has been reporting differently from each standpoint for each country, which is also part of the larger debate. There's so much questions, so much sometimes animosity between them. And I think that needs to change to really build trust for the future of Nile River Basin or Nile Basin Initiative per se. There's also, we have seen this sense of frozen conflicts. Frozen conflicts as a concept comes from more from the Cold War scenario. Kashmir has seen a lot of Kashmir Valley between India and Pakistan has seen frozen conflict for such a long time. It still continues in that there's no clear situation of there is conflict, there is a sense of war, but there is more kind of a destructive piece, which might erupt any day, might make the situation much worse than what it is right now. Hence, this is where the role of media, I think, is very, very important, and they need to really push this idea of bringing out the nuanced politics, especially which pertains to water conflicts or water wars scenario. We did a piece recently where we argued that there will be no water wars per se in the future. But what we really want is to look into the nuances of the politics between the states of what it really means, but also look into the governance aspect of it. And this is where kind of changes, role of media really has to look into. Present these stalemate situations and why there is a stalemate situation. And this will also push the narrative of finding more solutions, looking for more ways to move out of this rut where the states are stuck or they are not finding ways to really negotiate for water resources. Now, moving very quickly, I think there's also, it's not just the role of media, but the role of the media persons with the science has a very crucial role. The scientists have to work with media, and same goes vice versa. That will help to create a lot of science policy interface, but also take away all the myths and controversies, which a lot of river basins goes through, especially in the current post-truth world. Now, I'll very quickly take you through a Brahmaputra River Basin case where there is a science media diplomacy. I'll spend next 5 minutes or so on that, and then we'll close the presentation. If you look at the map, Brahmaputra is one of the river basins which flows from China to India to Bangladesh and eventually goes to Bay of Bengal. It's a 2,900 kilometers. There's no institutional arrangement. There's no sense of treaty there. Data is completely securitized because there's a conflict between India and China in the border areas where the Brahmaputra flows. The river has continuously seen annual floods for the last 49 years. So that's something which happens every year, but still there is no push for finding protection measures at the transboundary level. There's also a lot of mistrust because there's a lot of reporting from both sides of the media against or each other, saying that who is responsible for floods or who is responsible for the conflict between the two states. What we did in terms of science there was that we looked at the last 10 years of data. And this is specifically newspaper data collected from 4 countries where the river flows between India, China, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. And we looked what kind of analysis has been reported. So first is to see that there is a lack of science and policy interface. There's very limited sourcing from the scientific community in the Brahmaputra Basin. Most of the reports have been either reported post-conflict or post-flood situations, and whatever has been fed by the government. That means their data has been completely coming from, it's not a public source, it's not available to even academics. Whatever government feeds as a data is being reported. So if you see at the first graph, the governments and allied sectors only provide data sources to the media to whatever report. And that creates a lot of myths, controversies in the basin itself. Very quickly, if you look at the second graph, that shows that the number of science articles reported in the last 10 years on Brahmaputra are just 32 out of 2,400 articles, which is a big surprise to see that why only post-conflict or post-flood reporting has been there. And that shows itself that there is lack of science policy interface. We have made efforts to change that. We have trying to bring reporters from all the countries to work together to write joint pieces, but that will take time. And that's where the diplomacy work comes into picture. A last map or last graph I would like to show is to show you that on what topics there has been mostly the reporting from the 4 countries. If you look at it, If you look at India, Bangladesh, and China, or particularly India and Bangladesh, where most of the flooding happens, they only report on flooding, and that too post-flooding. There's been very limited focus on data sharing, on sovereignty issues, or research per se. So the research element is completely missing in this reporting, in this particular analysis, which kind of shows that why more research is required from Brahmaputra Basin. This was just to give you an example. I can answer more questions if there are more doubts or something else. But I would just like to quickly wrap it up with where do we want to go from here, and what role the science and media has in transboundary water conflicts and cooperation. I think most of the reporting I've seen is around water conflicts per se, and cooperation is somehow missing in that puzzle yet. And this is also because it's an easy sales pitch. It's the nuances of conflicts are missing. I think that makes the media report more on conflicts rather than on the cooperation angle, or the nuances of cooperation, or the nuances of conflict itself. So the science-based reporting is very, very essential here to avoid these kinds of myths and controversies. I think that is very, very important. To also build trust between the states, that is very, very crucial. I think there's a very essential role for media to play in track 1.5, track 2, and track 3 level of diplomacy. Because media wants to report more on conflicts, there is a sense of, it's not very easily acceptable to bring media people on board for diplomacy or for dialogue processes. That's my personal experience I'm talking about. We try and work with media separately then with scientists and other stakeholders. I think that wall has to be really broken down, and we need to bring these people together to sit down in one room, talk about it, and report about it also. I think there is some kind of rebranding on media's image to promote cooperation as also a big role to play. And I think it's our responsibility, it's not someone else's. And the last point I would like to make is that transboundary water debates are to be part of the public discourse. It's still not there. We talk about a lot of domestic conflicts on water, but I think transboundary waters, because it is securitized, it becomes an issue of national security. It is still not part of public discourse. And we need to understand there is a plurality of interests there of different states, and that needs to be communicated well. Conflicts are not necessarily bad to make an argument for. I think that's a good starting point to agree, but also make a disagreement and look for cooperation from that point. I'll just stop here, and I'm happy to take more questions from here on.
Thank you very much, Sumit. If you have any questions or would like any clarifications, please just chat along in our chat window. I think it was interesting what you said also about science communications, and science communication is important for better reporting. It means that we need to build better networks between communicators and journalists. Am I correct there? And we also need, I think, more comprehensive science communications. So when you were mentioning the research, that there was so little analysis on research when it came to your study there, you were missing the research reports, missing the research articles. Why do you think? Is it because of a lack of research, or is it because it's difficult to understand whatever research has been reported, or whatever research there were?
I think I would say it's both. It's not just one. It's both, because sometimes it's extremely difficult to understand what scientists are really trying to say. And I'm part of that. And it's sometimes very challenging for us to communicate appropriately with the media personnel to report it well. And the second is that there is a lack of science. And this is where the role of media people come into, that we need to push this agenda of how we can improve better science, how we can focus on better science so that we can report it accordingly. I'll just give you an instance for that. There was a sudden change in the color of water in the Brahmaputra River in 2017 or 18. And there were suddenly a lot of reporting in the newspaper, in the national as well as regional newspapers, or local newspapers, that there is a dam building happening in China, which is absolutely wrong, because if that would happen, they would be reported. It was simply because there was an earthquake and some of the debris went to the river, the color changed. But this took a while to get clarified. And this needs to be reported by the either scientific community or people who are well aware of the region, of what happens there. And this sometimes doesn't happen. And this leads to all these kinds of myths and controversies, especially in this post-truth world. It's very easy to create facts.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And on that note, I would like to, for all of you, we have a session tomorrow about misinformation and how we build resilience against misinformation. It's designed for the journalist class, but if any of you communicators would like to join, please feel free to do so, because it's a very important topic. And I would like to just ask this dam, well, this supposed dam that was built, do we know how that news came about in the first place when it was so obviously fake?
I think particularly it was reported in one of the local newspapers, and it was without sources. So if I'll show the graph maybe again. A lot of reporting, or a big number of reports which we collected in for last 10 years have no sources. And that itself tells you that the reporting which is being done in these newspapers are sometimes without sources, and it means it could not be correct. It could be incorrect.
Yes,
and that has happened.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's source is very important. Nada says, is there a benchmark, best-in-class example of transboundary water diplomacy that other countries and practitioners could learn from?
I don't think so. There is a benchmark for diplomacy. It's impossible to create. You can take examples, I'm sure, like I was giving you the example of Mekong River Commission per se, which took 37, almost 40 years, 4 decades to come together. And there are several, like we can look in Europe, the Danube example, which is quite good to look into, and the nitty-gritties and the nuances of it. And even if they come into an institutional arrangement, that doesn't mean that the problem is resolved. It's a continuous process. You would find new challenges. You would find, especially with changing climate and issues related to that. But I think these 2 examples can be considered. And now I've just come across a new, we're working, Geneva Water Hub is involved in that. The SAMB in Western Africa, where the 4 countries have come together to govern the groundwater aquifer, which is also transboundary in nature, but we don't talk about groundwater so much in transboundary. We are only busy with surface water, which is so much visible. And so there are these good examples which we can look into. I think media also has to report a lot on that to push the narrative of cooperation and not get into the rut of conflicts and water wars.
Yes, thank you. A good point, and maybe some ideas for our journalists in the class. Abubakar writes, based on my understanding, most of the transboundary water treaties have been signed without taking climate change effects, especially droughts and floods, into account. I think to mitigate the conflicts between countries, there is a need for revision of these treaties. What do you say, Sumit?
I think yes, I agree, but I think it's going to be extremely challenging now. I was giving you the example of the Ganges Treaty, which needs to be re-signed in 2026 because the treaty will fall out of its duration. And there are already debates about how much water to be shared with the changing climate, and do we have good numbers to discuss that? We have the global numbers on climate change, but do we have regional level, local level numbers to support how much water is really required by the countries to share? I think there's a big question. It's going to be a big task in the near future for re-looking into the numbers of water sharing aspects.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sumit. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions, your suggestions, and your input. I'll see if there are any questions that we've missed. I will send them to you, Sumit, and if you can have a look at them and send an answer in writing, and that I could then share with everyone, that's fine. But I think we have covered it most.
I'll be happy to answer if there are more questions.
Thank you. I'll have a look at it again. And thanks for everyone who's participated today. We are not yet finished. We are going to have a small networking session for the last few minutes of our workshop. Again, yes, Cecile has answered. I would like to say to everyone, same link today, tomorrow, on Thursday, all workshops, same link. We try to make it as easy as possible for everyone. And as I said, if you like to join any other classes that you find interesting on the program, you're free to do so.